G'day humans, welcome to the safe space for dangerous ideas. One of the most uncomfortable conversations that we tend to have when we're adolescents, when we're just forming our view of the world, but which we often then shunt aside later on in life, is the basic dangerous idea of what does it really mean to do the right thing versus doing the wrong thing? And how do we figure out the edge cases? When is it okay to lie, for example, to spare a greater harm? Is it okay to lavish your children with everything they need at the same time as you know that some of the money that you spend on them could be saving the lives of needier children overseas? There are big ethical flare-ups in modern culture, like is it okay to kill an itsy-bitsy, teeny-weeny little pre-baby in a mummy's tummy? Should she have the right to do so? This abortion debate has, of course, roiled the United States for decades, whether or not gay people should be allowed to marry each other. But often we just sort of take as a given our underlying ethical assumptions about the rest of our lives. And most of what we believe in Western secular liberal culture is some form of utilitarianism or consequentialism, whose most significant advocate in this generation and arguably of the 20th century would have to be Peter Singer, a former guest on this show. In fact, I moderated Peter Singer's live events when he was in Australia, and I hope to have him on the show again soon. He literally coined the term animal liberation in his book of the same name in the 1970s, and he's had more of an impact than perhaps any other living moral philosopher on the way that both philosophers think and therefore the way that we all think about doing right and doing wrong. And his basic position is a utilitarian one, is that the greatest good for the greatest number of people should be our moral yardstick rather than some sort of more theological or absolutist moral position that says that there are things that are intrinsically right or intrinsically wrong regardless of the impact that they have on people. I was very struck then to read a well-thought-out essay that challenged my assumptions about this by today's guest, Bo Winegard. The essay is entitled Against Singerism, subtitled Peter Singer is rightly applauded as a philosophical giant. He's also spectacularly wrong. That's an audacious claim to make, and so I wanted to dig into it and say, well, if we can't base our sense of what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's immoral and moral, and how we should live on our judgment about whether or not it improves the lot of the largest number of people, then what exactly are we doing when we talk about leading a good life? This is a fascinating romp through moral philosophy. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Bo Winegard got his PhD in social psychology from Florida State University. He's interested in human evolution and social psychology. He has a Substack, which you should definitely also follow. I hope you enjoy as much as I did. The one and only Bo Winegard. Peter Singer deserves his reputation as an intellectual giant because he's wrong, spectacularly and extravagantly wrong, and that you believe that Singerism is not just wrong but pernicious, that he's mistaken about the nature of reality. So when you come at the king, you best not miss. What's your case?
Well, that's a very big question. To go backward, I would say also, so that's, I think those were the first couple of sentences of the piece, of which, you attempt to grab attention, obviously, with your first few sentences. I should say, I think Singer is spectacularly wrong, but I think he deserves his reputation as an intellectual colossus, not just because he's wrong, as I sort of suggested in that first paragraph, but also because he's obviously a very intelligent, interesting thinker who champions free speech and debate. He does things the right way. So my disagreement with Singer is not a disagreement about how he goes about doing philosophy. It's a disagreement with his conclusions. I think more people should actually attempt to behave the way Singer does. Okay, so my case, it was a long case. I could talk about it for a long time. So maybe we should break it up. But I would say this. So there's Singer's thought, and then there's Singerism. I think Singerism is sort of like Marxism or Freudianism, in which it's sort of a degenerate clone of the genius. So like whatever one thinks about Marxism, Marx was undoubtedly a genius. Marxism becomes much more crude, inevitably. Same thing with Freudianism, same thing with Singer. So Singer is a much more sophisticated thinker than people I put into the category I would call Singerists or Singerism. I would contend that Singer is committed to three important premises, all of which I think are dubious. One, utilitarianism. Two, cosmopolitanism. And three, ethical rationalism. So I spend my piece attempting to cast doubt on all three of those premises. And if all three of those are wrong, then Singer is spectacularly wrong since he subscribes to all three of those.
And for people who aren't sort of wonks of moral philosophy, Bo, how would you summarize the worldview of Singerism and the role that what does it claim? How does it differ from other moral claims, and how much influence does it have over the way that lay people think about ethics in the West?
Yeah, that's a great. So to start, before getting into that worldview in more detail, I should say Singer is one of probably the most popular moral philosopher and one of the towering moral philosophers in all of history. I think legitimately. Now, I don't know if his position there will hold up over time, if he'll take his place with Kant and Aristotle, but he's very popular right now, very influential. I've known people from my whole life who were incredibly influenced by Singer, often because of his, what I view as a laudable attempt to mainstream animal rights. And, well, maybe you wouldn't call them animal rights. That gets into complicated more. But the way we treat animals, drawing attention to that. He also, if you've seen, I don't know if you're familiar with, I forget. Is it called The Good Place with
that terrific sitcom?
Yeah. So I haven't. I think I watched an episode or two. I wasn't drawn into it, but
you have to watch the first season, Bo. You have to get to the end of the first season. It's really, there's a twist that I won't give up at the end of the first season. But it is cleverly done, the way they extract humor from pretty profound moral questions.
Yeah. So I should give it more time. So I don't want to cast aspersions on the show because I only watched a couple episodes. But the show was influenced by Singer, and in fact, the name escapes me. Tax Shepard's wife. That sounds misogynistic. Like I know
Kristen
Bell?
Stewart Bell. No, there are too many Christian. Kristen Bell.
Yeah, Bell. She reads Singer's books. This is irrelevant. I'm sorry. I'm going down the digression.
This is the way a couple of moral philosophy wonks understand the pop culture universe. There's a bunch of people who are probably blonde named Kristen or Kirsten something, and one of them was in this show.
Well, and she read one of Singer's books for Audible. But at any rate, the Singer worldview, it really, in some ways, you would claim that Singer himself is not forwarding a new moral philosophy because he subscribes to utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? The simplest way to put utilitarianism, I think, is that it contends the only thing of intrinsic moral value is pleasure and pain, or subjective mental states, if you want to go a little bit more broad. And that the goal of morality and a moral philosophy should be to encourage people to increase pleasures and decrease pains, to maximize overall utility. Now, that gets right there, there's a lot of problems already. Are we maximizing aggregate utility or average utility, for example? We can get into those weeds, but let's just sit there. Okay, so Singer, for most of his career, was not, he was a different kind of utilitarian. He was what is called the preference utilitarian. I hope this does not bore the listeners because these details can be important. Preference utilitarian thinks that you should maximize people's preferences, not necessarily their mental states, happiness, sadness, whatever, that you should maximize happiness, decrease sadness, but rather their preferences. So if I want to be a poet, but my path to becoming a poet is rather tortured. Maybe Lord Byron's my hero, and I think you have to live a dangerous life, suffer to create art. A preference utilitarian would suggest that you should attempt to maximize that preference or maximize as many preferences as we can, regardless of the, like, if it increases happiness.
Right. I like that you've gone for an example of a poet leading a tortured life rather than the more obvious but gutter example of someone who's into BDSM or something like that. Like, there could be a person who likes pain, and the Singer version of utilitarianism would be, that's okay. You don't have to narrowly maximize pleasure and minimize pain as long as it's what their preference is, and people have the capacity to articulate their preferences in the world successfully.
Yeah, that's a good salacious example. I like that one. Yeah, so you could use that. Now, this is where it gets tricky, though, because Singer more recently actually converted to hedonic utilitarianism. So now he thinks it is about mental states, and that what you should maximize is happiness or flourishing. That gets problematic, trying to define happiness, but some sort of mental state of well-being. And he's also, and this is another important distinction, he's an act utilitarian. Utilitarianism, there's a lot of conflicts in this broad umbrella. And one of the major conflicts is, should you be an act-based utilitarian or a rule-based utilitarian? An act-based thinks the moral question should be about each behavior. A rule-based utilitarian says we should figure out the rules that on average lead to the most well-being. And sometimes you will follow the rule and maybe it won't lead to the most well-being in that particular case, but on average, these rules would lead to the most well-being. It turns out that can be an important distinction as we get into some of my disagreements with utilitarianism. I think rule-based utilitarianism is actually a more plausible moral view than act-based for various reasons.
Do you want to just tease that out with an example of an instance in which rule-based utilitarianism would overcome some kind of obviously undesirable outcome of act utilitarianism?
Yeah. So I think it's been a long time since I wrote the piece.
I'm not referring to a thing in the piece. I could make one up. You could make one up. A famous person who's wrongly convicted of a crime, for example.
Well, there's like imagine that a very popular celebrity actually beats his girlfriend, let's say, and let's say that he is adored by hundreds of millions of people around the world. And if they found out that he was smacking around his girlfriend, they would be horrified and it would decrease their mental states. They call these hedons if you measure them. So let's say
a hedon. A hedon is a unit of pleasure.
A unit of pleasure, yeah. So let's say that this would decrease their hedon. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So this is hundreds of millions, even if it's only 0.5 hedons, we're talking about a huge decrease in overall hedonic state of the earth. And let's say that if the police didn't intervene, the woman would suffer a lot. So she loses a lot of hedons, but it's nowhere near the overall hedons that the whole globe loses finding out that this pop star is a fraud and a violent spousal abuser, let's say. It seems to me an act utilitarian, to be completely consistent, would have to accept that perhaps we shouldn't convict this person, right? Perhaps the police shouldn't intervene because that would actually decrease the overall hedonic state of the planet. A rule-based utilitarian would say, no. On average, if we intervene and enforce a consistent rule of law, regardless of the specifics of each individual case, it would increase the overall hedonic state of the earth. And therefore, rule-based utilitarianism is more plausible and more consistent, I think, with moral intuitions that we have.
Right, because you're likely to enhance pleasure more on a global scale if there's a universal rule against beating your domestic partner than in the short-term instance of saying that we should exonerate this particular guy because ultimately... And we should also point out, if people are thinking, well, hang on, I mean, would it really make hundreds of millions of people that much sadder just because a pop star was revealed to be... I mean, maybe they'd get some kind of salacious joy out of the gossip or something. That's not the point, right? You can always find an example. Like, imagine that it's that the person is a holy person who gives enormous meaning. I mean, you can even think about this is probably the Catholic Church. I was just going to say this was probably going on in the heads of a lot of the senior clergy who were covering up child abuse by thinking, we know that this is wrong if you look at it in isolation as an act, but think about the long-term consequences and the greater good of people losing their faith in the church and how much comfort the Catholic Church gives to hundreds of millions of people around the world, or more than 1 billion people around the world. You can imagine that kind of a rationale operating where they go for the rule utilitarianism over the act.
Yeah, and as you say, like, one can always be skeptical about any particular thought experiment here, but the point still stands that there's a difference, an important difference, right, between the rule-based utilitarian and the act-based utilitarian. Now, Singer is an act-based utilitarian, and he has some pretty sophisticated arguments defending that in, I think it's in The Point of View of the Universe with his co-author. I won't go into those because those get like very abstruse, but suffice it to say he's an act-based utilitarian. I think utilitarianism, I should say, I think in my first year of grad school or so, I was a committed utilitarian. So I come at this from, I'm a lapsed utilitarian, as it were, a fallen utilitarian. I think utilitarianism it's untenable. I think there are too many problems with it to sustain. And therefore, I think, of course, Singer's wrong just because of that, if nothing else. But I also think the other parts of his thought are wrong. Perhaps one could say that those flow naturally from utilitarianism. That is to say, cosmopolitanism is a natural consequence of being a utilitarian. Maybe I just separated them for ease of exposition, and I think it's useful to make these distinctions.
Yeah. So staying on utilitarianism, I think it would be true to say that most people intuitively in the West, if they're not religious, if they're secular, are generally utilitarians. They may not go as far as Singer, but the general idea that they're probably rule utilitarians with a preference for the preference version, meaning that they might think it's too narrow to say that every single act should be judged on whether or not it increases pleasure or reduces pain. But they'd probably agree that the way that we should structure things should be aimed towards principles and rules that increase the capacity of people to flourish.
Yes.
And decrease impediments to people's preferences being sought and realized, right?
I think you are right that I'm not sure if they would be rule-based preference utilitarians. You might be right on that, but I do think some kind of vague utilitarianism is widespread among atheist intellectuals and educated lay people alike. I agree with that. I think this is where it gets difficult, because if you were to say to me, and importantly, Singer is not this, but if you said, I am a rule-based preference utilitarian, I think we have a lot of common ground. I think when you did that version of utilitarianism, I think is quite plausible. I might find some problems with it. I think most of the issues, though, with Singer's thought come precisely from rejecting that version of utilitarianism. I should say,
and looking more narrowly at whether specific acts increase happiness and decrease
often, yes.
Unhappiness. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Sorry, what were you just going to say?
Oh, I this is more speculative, but I do think perhaps worth noting. I think one of the things that's appealing about utilitarianism, especially for people who are not believers, is that it gives, in my view, the illusion of some kind of objective moral framework and some kind of way to debate moral issues by appeal to apparently pure reason, right? So it used to be at one time, if we got into a moral tussle, let's say you and I would cite scripture because that was the sort of culturally accepted authority on moral issues. And then maybe you would cite a different passage of scripture and say, no, this, and then here's it. Well, we can't do that in public discourse anymore. If you're in the Catholic Church, you can do that, but not in our Western, secular public discourse. Therefore, utilitarianism is appealing because you could say, no, this is rational. I'm appealing to the subjective mental states and the maximization of overall happiness or hedons or whatever we want, right? So I do think that's something appealing about it.
And just before we go into the criticism of your criticisms, maybe it's also worth just briefly outlining what an alternative to utilitarianism is, because it's so deeply embedded, I think, in our common sense norms about morality today, especially on the secular side of the aisle, that people might sort of be saying, well, of course our behavior should have something to do with what the consequences of that behavior is and its impact on other sentient creatures and humans. Like, on what other foundation that isn't biblical would you base right and wrong?
Yeah, so there's one of the fundamental sort of dichotomies. Thinkers love dichotomies, so it makes things simple. So we have consequentialism on one side, and deontological ethics on the other. Consequentialists say ethics are about the consequences. Deontologists would say, and this is a different framework for morality, which is an alternative to utilitarianism, they would say some things are just intrinsically good or bad that are not related to mental states necessarily. Like the act itself can be good or bad. A Kantian, for example, after Immanuel Kant, who forwarded famous categorical imperative, it was called, the notion that you should act in such a way that you could will everybody act that way and it would be consistent, or the social contract or the social world would work. So he said, for example, lying would violate the categorical imperative, because if I lie, I'm in a sense saying everybody can lie. And if everybody lies, society just falls to pieces. It breaks apart. So the very act of lying is antithetical to moral reason and therefore wrong. In fact, and I think modern listeners will find this a bit repellent, Kant actually argued perversely that if you were hiding somebody, it's basically Kant's version. I'm going to change it just slightly. Essentially, if you're hiding somebody from the Nazis, now Nazis came after Kant's time, but it doesn't matter. It fits with his argument. And somebody asks you a direct question, are you hiding this person? And you know that they will take the person and kill the person. Lying is still wrong. Now, Kant legitimately argued that. He argued it was still wrong actively to lie. Now, he did make a distinction between not answering and saying something that was false. But that's how strongly committed he was to this deontological argument that certain behaviors can just be wrong regardless of the consequences.
And so this is because of what you just said about his worldview of what the categorical imperative, I think, is the nerd's term for it, right? Which is that your act as if your behavior was going to become a general rule.
Yeah.
So if you don't want to live in a world in which everybody lies, then don't lie. Right. The problem with deontology from the consequentialist's point of view is that they will always say, well, okay, but the only reason why you don't want to live in a world in which everybody lies is because it has bad consequences. If it didn't have bad consequences on any human beings, if there were no human beings, if you were the only person in the world and there were no human beings and there was no measure of pleasure or pain or preferences being fulfilled or not, you're just sort of smuggling into your Kantian deontology consequentialism, in other words, a consideration of what the consequences of these acts are going to be without acknowledging it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And if you look at Kant's response to the person who made this challenge to him, he specifically appeals to consequences ultimately because he says, well, look, if people start lying in these situations, then you have these exceptions, and then anybody can lie and nobody can trust anybody again, and it breaks apart. And you're right. Ultimately, that's a kind of appeal to the consequences. I think Kant would say, well, really what it's an appeal to is just reason. If we just think about, is this consistent with reason? And I guess you can never separate that entirely from the consequences. I completely agree with you. And I think that's a fair argument for a consequentialist to make. So I would say the difference is they're on a continuum. The question is, how far away are the consequences in your moral assessment? So for a Kantian, the consequences are maybe farther away. Like you're like, okay, yes, ultimately this would lead to the ruin of society, and you can say that that's a consequence. But we're not looking at the sort of narrow consequences of each specific act. We're looking at the act itself and they're saying that's wrong. Whereas what Singer would say is, look, that's absurd. If you're in that context, clearly you care more about the immediate consequences, namely somebody might get killed by the Nazis, and therefore it would be morally repugnant to tell the person, yeah, I'm hiding the person, or to tell the truth in that situation.
But I mean, I'm not sure that sort of Kantian defense of saying, well, at the end of the day, after you follow the yellow brick road far enough, sure, you get to consequences, is very robust, because then that's just basically rule consequentialism slightly distended, right? It's basically saying, like, we've got this rule, which is don't lie. Ultimately, the reason why it's a rule is because it has bad consequences. But those bad consequences, don't worry, they're so far away that we're going to ignore them. They're so abstracted, and we're going to pretend we've got some rationalistic foundation for the claim that lying is wrong in the absence of any impact that it might have on anybody. It sounds like a fudge to me.
Okay, so without claiming that I'm defending Kant here, what I would say is, just from my own point of view, I think your argument's correct. And actually, I think the line between rule-based utilitarianism and some kind of deontology is very thin, right? Because almost everybody, I don't care how how strident in your deontology you are, you're going to care about consequences at some point, right? If, let's suppose that we took this question and it's like, if you don't lie, the human species will die. The earth will be blown to smithereens. Let's say it's like we're Star Wars. We have the Death Star. Either we lie or we tell the truth and our planet is obliterated by the Death Star. I can't imagine a deontologist saying, I don't care. You still have to tell the truth.
I mean, they'd have to, wouldn't they? That's just the same version as the Anne Frank example, but bigger.
No, I know. You're right. It gets tricky now. I don't know. I wish we could. I wish we could somehow resurrect Kant and we could ask him this question. I would love to hear his answer.
Well, I'm sure there are enthusiastic Kant scholars who have drunk the Kool-Aid.
Yes, but I should be cautious here because I haven't read that literature in a long time, the Kantian literature. I do remember many of the modern Kantians were a little uncomfortable with how enthusiastically he embraced this. And I think many of them did make qualifications for certain consequences. And as you say, again, the line is thin. It's not clear what the distinction would be between a rule-based utilitarian and somebody who's mostly deontological. So yeah, these things get messy. They're attempts, as with almost any conceptual framework, they're just attempts to pick out viewpoints, and they're kind of fuzzy.
Right. Okay. And so if we've established sort of deontology and Kant as the main alternative to consequentialism, in that there are... Please.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm interrupted, but because this is what I will defend at the end of this. If we get to my own positive moral philosophy,
I'm sorry, we'll run out of time before we get to any of your actual substantive points.
But if we get to that after the criticism of Singer, what I would say is there's kind of a pragmatic alternative too, which is what I subscribe to. My view is there's no entirely coherent, consistent moral philosophy, or what you might call a meta philosophy or whatever. Rather, I care about human flourishing, specifically the flourishing of the communities in which I dwell. And I think other people should care about the flourishing of their communities. And that means I care about mental states to some degree, but it also means I subscribe to some deontological commitments, because I think rules are often important, and it's important to deter people from making exceptions to rules, right? Because everybody thinks they're the exception. Oh yeah, I'm going to cheat here or cheat there or whatever, but it's actually for the greater good because, right? And that's why we just need to say, nope, it's just wrong. So I would say some kind of pragmatism is also an alternative, a less sexy alternative at that.
Right. Well, it's easier to embody because it's slipperier, right? And that's the criticism that would come of your morality from either deontologists or consequentialists, which is all you're doing is following your whims and your likes and your preferences, and you're cherry picking from deontology and consequentialism in order to retroactively reinforce what you feel in your gut, but there's no clear or consistent or coherent philosophical or moral framework for your positions. You're just trying to have a bob each way.
Yeah. Yes, but those are fair criticism, I would say. I will defend the pragmatist against those in the future here, but not quite yet. I'll get to Singer first, because I think people are more interested in Singer than my own moral position.
Well, I think we're all interested in trying to figure out what's right and wrong and how to live a good life, so both are probably relevant. So, and just before we, I know this is a long preface, but you jumped from utilitarian to consequentialist without commenting on the difference. What's the difference between consequentialism and utilitarianism?
Good point. Yeah, good check on me. Okay, so consequentialism contends that morality should care about consequences, but it doesn't necessarily contend that those consequences must be mental states or hedon or whatever we want to call them, utility. So, for example, G. Moore was a consequentialist of sorts, but he thought there were sort of intrinsic goods like beauty, truth, it's friendship, let's say. So he would say, rather than attempting to maximize hedons or try to do some hedonic calculus, we should maximize the amount of beauty and truth in the world, the amount of friendship. So there are multiple or plural goods rather than just one, right? Because you could say utilitarian is monastic, or it believes in one measure, right? Some one unit of good. Its mental states they can go to, let's say, we'll just pretend they can go to 100 or they can be at 0. That's the measure. Somebody else a pluralist might say, no, there are like 10 different things. Let's say, you can have great friendships, you can have a lot of truth, you can have beauty in your life, you can have adventures, whatever. Nature might be a good. Yeah. So there are different varieties of consequentialism, and utilitarianism is probably the most popular form of it, but it's not the only one.
Okay, and the greatest advocate of that way of thinking is Peter Singer. So we've talked about, so let's stick with utilitarianism and your critique of that. We've talked about the question of whether or not you assess individual acts or general rules to determine whether an act is right or wrong. Also, whether or not you're just looking at pleasure and pain in the sort of abacus tallying sense, or something like the satisfaction of people's preferences. So the question of whether it's okay to inflict pain on rapists or terrorists might be a place to start.
Okay, yeah.
Here.
I think that is really important because I see what attracted me to utilitarianism early on was I thought that they were correct, that the only thing of intrinsic value in the universe was pleasure and pain. Like pleasure is good. It doesn't need anything else. It's good in and of itself, and pain is bad in and of itself. And I thought, okay, well, if you start with that, you get utilitarianism. I've come to believe that that's a flawed view. I don't think pleasure and pain are intrinsically good or bad. They're intrinsically pleasant or unpleasant, right? If you prick me with a pin, that's unpleasant. Of course, you must have a masochist, right? And that's a complication. And if I eat cheesecake, that's good. It's pleasant. But we can think of all kinds of examples where pleasure is actually bad and pain is actually perhaps good. Let's start with pleasure first, because I think the pain one is like more persuasive. But the pleasure one's interesting. So I'm a former smoker. I tried to quit smoking, and it's brutal, absolutely incredibly difficult. And every once in a while, you cheat a cigarette. And when you cheat a cigarette, it feels really good. But you don't want it to feel good. In some sense, you actually hate that it makes you feel good. You almost wish you smoked the cigarette and then you vomited and were sick for days, so you would never be tempted by the siren song of the cigarette again. So that's a case where I think actually you could make the argument pleasure's bad. And of course, we can think of more consequential examples, heroin, and so forth. I did the example in the article, which I thought was interesting, for provoking moral intuition. So suppose that a person, they walk around a playground and they just wanted to watch kids fall and cry. Now, they didn't do anything, so they weren't actively causing harm. But if they saw a kid crying, it gave them pleasure. I think we would say there's something morally wrong about that. Now, a utilitarian, it seems, would have to say, well, if the person's not harming anybody, they're just observing the world, this was going to happen anyway. The fact that they feel pleasure must be a good. It's a good thing. It's good to feel pleasure. It's intrinsically good. I think that's wrong. I think it's clearly wrong in that we actually judge people's behaviors and their pleasures, and pleasures can be bad. Furthermore, pain can be good, and this gets to punishment. So if we inflict pain upon a serial rapist or a terrorist, I think that's a good thing. I think they deserve pain, and I think it's a proper, the universe is better, as it were, if heinous criminals suffer pain. A utilitarian...
Why is that, though? I don't think that's morally obvious to people. Why do you think it is?
Okay, so if that's not morally obvious to people, then I don't
have just to clarify what I'm saying. I think it's morally obvious that those people should be prevented from doing what they're doing. So you want to lock them up. I think it's morally obvious to people that you should provide some kind of a deterrent effect that would have a consequential impact on other people's behavior and discourage them. Right. So if there's a rationale that you want to punish them, but then you could also just pretend to be punishing them. Which would be, exactly. Right? You could in order to cause the deterrent effect. If we know that, for example, torturing terrorists to get information out of them doesn't work, let's assume that we know that, even if I don't know that we do know that. In that universe, I'm not sure that I understand. And if we also are ambivalent about free will and don't know whether or not these people have the capacity to do otherwise, it strikes me like, why is it good to inflict pain on a shark after a shark kills a person? Why is it good to inflict pain on a serial rapist because they're a serial rapist? Like, just get them the hell away from women and, provide some kind of deterrent to other would-be rapists, and that's that. I think further pain infliction, that doesn't strike me as moral.
Okay, that's interesting. So we have competing intuitions there, and I suppose your intuition would be closer to Singer's intuition, or perhaps Singer arrived at it through logic or reasoning about moral issues. My strong intuition is that if somebody does something heinous to a person in my community or to my sister or whatever, I want that person to suffer. Now, I want that to be proportionate suffering.
But hang on, sorry. I also just don't want to be misunderstood. I'm talking about what I think is moral. I'm not talking about what my animal gut reptilian brain makes me want to do. Of course, if someone rapes my sister, I'm going to want to cut their head off, kick their balls out of their skull and, dump them in a river. That doesn't mean that is the way that I believe that society should treat, as a general principle, people who do bad things. I think that, of course, I have immoral instincts, but it doesn't strike me as obviously the correct thing to do to inflict pain beyond what's necessary.
Right. Okay. Very fair qualification. I didn't mean to suggest that the alternative was you didn't feel like this passion, desire to inflict pain on these people. I guess let me rephrase my intuition. The intuition that I have is that it's actually moral to inflict some kind of pain on these people. Now, I think it needs to be a well-regulated kind of infliction of pain. That is to say, typically what we do now is it's a deprivation of freedom, which is undoubtedly painful. I mean, people don't want to go to jail. It's generally unpleasant, or prison. It's unpleasant. I guess, so you were making more or less the utilitarian case for punishment, which is like, of course, we want deterrence and we want these people to be sequestered from society if they're going to cause harm, etc. But do we need any, is it just to cause any pain beyond that, right? I guess my strong intuition is that it is morally just, and that the suffering of the wicked is actually a moral good. And I guess I'm not sure that I can make an argument, a rational argument, and this is fitting with my pragmatism. I don't really think there is one. I think we're using human intuitions, and we're the kinds of creatures who think the wicked should suffer. Now, if you say to me, you don't think that, or you don't have that feeling, I would say, okay, I don't know that I'm going to persuade you. But what I would argue, and you would agree with this, is that the desire to cause suffering in perpetrators of heinous crimes probably evolved to create a deterrent effect. And therefore, I would be a little bit cautious about trying to eradicate that impulse from humans, or arguing that there's something immoral or amoral about it, if that makes sense.
It sort of does, but it does again feel a little bit like cherry picking, in the sense that there are deep primal motivations in the human species, not merely to punish rapists, but also to rape, and also to kill and exclude other communities who aren't like ours, and to excommunicate heretics, and to burn witches at the stake, and to do all kinds of terrible things that we are all sort of natively hardwired to do. The rates of male violence among young males are off the charts. So I don't know why you couldn't apply your rationale to instances of violence that you presumably don't condone. If the rationale is, this is the way humans are hardwired, there are probably good evolutionary reasons for males to be so violent, for us to have these instincts. That just strikes me as a slippery slope, where I don't know what ground you're standing on to say that the retributive violence is good because it's an innate urge, but other forms of bloodlust aren't.
That's a very fair criticism. So I will say, first, yes, you're right. No, my appeal is not only to human nature. I do think human nature is relevant, obviously, for any kind of moral question, because we're talking about morals among humans. Squirrels would have a very different morality, presumably, from humans. Right?
Don't steal my nuts.
Exactly. Right. So, but your point is well taken. So what I would say is, I care about community flourishing. I think that is a little bit more objective. It's not just an appeal to human nature. I mean, of course, communities flourish when they have policies that are congruent with human nature. I mean, communism failed precisely because it's incongruent with human nature. But you're right, we have all kinds of innate impulses and lusts that we attempt to discourage. And I'm generally a conservative, social conservative, and we're especially skeptical of human nature. So you're right, I shouldn't just say, well, it's human nature. I guess what I would say on top of the fact that I think it's a just impulse that humans have is also flourishing communities likely flourish precisely because they threaten serious punishment to malefactors and wrongdoers. You might say, and this is where we would just run into like a philosophical conundrum, and we could talk about it for hours, and it's interesting, but I don't know that there's any solution to it. You might say, well, yes, I could agree with that even as a utilitarian, because I care about deterrence, etc. Then we'd have to go to thought experiments. So you get to these thought experiments where you're like, well, let's say you have this heinous rapist who, let's say you rape 7 people in your community, and they say they're punishing him, right? The claim is we're putting this person in this, uncomfortable prison for the rest of his life. The cockroaches crawling around, dilapidated. He never sees the sun, etc. But actually, they take him to a private island, and he lives a pretty comfortable life there. Now, from a deterrent perspective, deterrence has been satisfied, right? On the other hand, I have the feeling that there's something, and I cannot justify this without appeal to some kind of metaphysics, but I think there's something metaphysically unjust about that.
Right.
Like, I think that person should be punished. I don't care that it wouldn't add to the deterrent effect. I actually want the person to be punished, and I would argue that it would actually make the world more just. But there we would run into complications. So let me ask you a question instead. Do you think, or were you persuaded, or are you persuaded that pleasure is not always good?
Yeah, I'm persuaded by that.
Okay, but maybe not that pain is sometimes good?
Yeah, no, pain is sometimes good and pleasure is sometimes bad. I can get on board with that, yeah.
So we can agree on that, and then maybe we would get into a tussle about some of the details.
Yeah, I mean, just to get away from just one final point on the question of sort of it being good to inflict pain on wicked people beyond what's necessary for deterrence. Right. I would simply note, and wasn't there a vice presidential debate like in the 1980s where he was asked by the interviewer, by the moderator, because he was against the death penalty.
Yes.
What would you do? What would you want to happen to someone who raped and killed your wife?
Yes.
Like on stage, on live TV, quite a provocative question. And he sort of just lost the debate by waffling on about how he doesn't believe in the death penalty. When, of course, what he should have said was the distinction that I made earlier, which is I would want to murder that person and spread their entrails all over my neighborhood. And that's precisely why we have laws and systems to prevent me from doing that. And I think the death penalty is equally barbaric. But just on the question of community flourishing, I don't think it's obvious that communities which are most barbaric in their retribution, like by cutting the hands off of people who steal, are better and more flourishing than ones like the Norwegians who send their, serial killers to basically what you were talking about, the luxury islands and so on. So that just point of difference there. But I take your.
I totally agree with you. By the way, that in fact, there's probably a relation between community flourishing and rather tame punishment.
And I mean, this comes to this raises one of the common critiques that are leveled at people like, well, I was going to say people like you, but really all people who dabble in moral philosophy, because it's that the examples are so detached from
Yes.
the real
Yes.
world. Like your example
Oh, yeah.
of sending the serial rapist away, a serial murderer to an island.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
or even the example of a person who enjoys watching children being harmed.
Yes.
Like, is there something intrinsically wrong with that? Well, maybe the intrinsically wrong thing with that is that we live in a world in which the abstract example of an innocent person who is going to do no harm, who is a good member of society and psychologically stable, who also enjoys watching children being harmed, is a fiction. That that's a unicorn. That in reality, people who enjoy watching children being harmed are likely to be people who will harm children or be dysfunctional in other ways.
Yeah.
So we say, as a general rule of thumb, we should object to that behavior and regard that behavior, even though the consequences of the act are not immediately and verifiably negative in terms of their consequences and their infliction of pain. It's a fantasy. It's a philosopher's fantasy, completely unmoored from reality, to invent these scenarios in which such a person exists. What do you make of that critique?
Oh, I share that. I think that's a very fair, germane criticism of ethical philosophy. It's a criticism I even made against Singer's thought experiment, which I will get to in some time and point out where I think it goes wrong. But I think you're right. I think that is very fair. I guess what I would say is, if you forward a moral philosophy which purports to be objectively true and precise, then it's fair to criticize it using fantastical thought experiments. Now, you could retort, well, look, in the real world, this, that, this. And I would say, I agree with you, but that's why we should just be pragmatists who deal with the real world.
Right.
And not
right.
these morally precise philosophies.
Okay, so let's continue with your criticisms of Singer's utilitarianism, now that we've established that simply looking at pleasure as being good and pain as bad is too crude a metric. The other one that you come to is whether or not it implies that some people who have a greater capacity to spread pain or pleasure matter more than people who don't. Like, is it an anti-egalitarian philosophy, utilitarianism? Because if you're a brilliant musician or a brilliant doctor, do you need to be treated better than I don't know, someone who doesn't have the same capacity to spread pleasure?
Yeah, some middling farmer in Kansas, let's say. So to be clear here, there's nothing wrong with moral elitism. Somebody could persuade me of moral elitism. My complaint is rather
moral elitism, meaning that some people are more deserving of our consideration than others because of their influence?
Somebody could make this argument to me. We could have an argument about it. Somebody could say, well, actually, the gifted neurosurgeon is more valuable. And I would be willing to hear that argument. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I'm saying I think there's a moral case there. My objection, this argument is designed not to object to that necessarily, but rather to point out that an egalitarian utilitarianism, a utilitarianism which says all people should matter the same, actually ends up undermining itself, because people don't matter ultimately. What matters is pleasure and pain. So in some sense, the individual becomes dwarfed by utility calculus here. And the point that I think the example that I gave is well, let's just take this gifted neurosurgeon. So if this neurosurgeon his ability to contribute to a community's utility is, let's say, 50 times greater than a midwit bachelor who smokes a lot of weed and works at Walmart. Nothing wrong with that, but that person is their job is replaceable, of course, whereas the gifted neurosurgeon is not. I think you'd have to argue, so long as pleasure and pain motivate people's behavior, which it clearly does, that we should care more about the doctor's mental states than about the the Midwest Walmart workers' mental states, right? Because suppose that the doctor, the neurosurgeon says, look, this is hard. My job is hard. I'm not going to do it unless I'm very well recompensed. And that means I get to have lots of women, lots of money, anything that causes me discomfort, I'll quit, you know. Basically, it's somebody like House. Do you watch that show?
Yeah.
You know, like this cantankerous genius. Everybody bends over backward for him because he's a freaking genius and he's actually more valuable than the other workers at this hospital. So the point here is
this is Hugh Laurie playing the sort of medical. It's basically a detective show, but about human illness essentially.
Yeah,
because there's always some really mysterious thing that no other doctor can figure out, and he's the one who manages to put the pieces together.
After he fails 3 times, he figures it out in an epiphany right at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But isn't this, Bo, doesn't this risk running into the unicorn problem in the sense that there aren't very many houses in the world, doctor houses that is, that it's unlikely, you said, if it's the case that increased pleasure increases the productivity of the neurosurgeon,
right.
That's a big if. I mean, it may not be the case that being surrounded by hookers and cocaine and is great for the surgeon's output. I mean, good people do good things because they're doing good things. Giving talented people more enjoyment probably only works up to a very limited point, and then a certain amount of stress and pain and regret is probably motivational for them and probably helps the consequentialist calculus.
That's fair. Maybe the way I put it was rather crass and materialistic, hookers and cocaine.
Because I mean, the reality is that we already do this.
Yeah, we do.
But we do this to the extent that there is a consequentialist utility to making life better for neurosurgeons than for Walmart clerks. This is what we do. This is why we pay neurosurgeons $450,000 a year instead of $40,000 a year.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. But I guess the point, you're right. Again, this is kind of an abstract philosophical argument, but the point of it is, ultimately, it undermines any kind of egalitarian individualism, because what becomes the supreme concern is pleasure and pain. It almost doesn't matter in what mind the pleasure and pain is taking place. I think for example, I have a deontological commitment to some kind of individual rights and rule of law. And I think that I wouldn't want to negotiate those for pain and pleasure, right? I would say, we want those and we want a commitment to them regardless of the effects on one gifted individual or not, right? Whereas I think if you're consistent in act-based utilitarian, again, you might say I'm a rule-based preference utilitarian and these criticisms wouldn't apply to that. But if you're an act-based utilitarian specifically, I think you have to bite the bullet on some of these and say, well, yes, if now, you might say, well, most of these are fantastic. Well, fair enough. But if this were true, you would have to accept it as an act-based utilitarian. I think that is undermining of the intellectual structure of that form of utilitarianism. It still works in the world for the most part, because you're right. Like, generally speaking, things aren't this extreme, and I'm concocting thought experiments that very rarely manifest in the world. But I'm just trying to point out that there's something intellectually wrong about it.
Right, fair enough. But the thing that's intellectually wrong is that you can't pair egalitarianism, like equality, with it, because it's not like, suppose that you've got the neurosurgeon who, if they get a blowjob from a hooker every Friday night, they do a slightly better job. Let's just stipulate that that's the case. Then the utilitarian has to say that it is morally better for them to do that than to not, if they're assuming that there are no other negative consequences involved, and also that they're more deserving of it than the Walmart employee is. There's nothing that strikes me that's inconsistent about that within the framework of utilitarianism. Are you just saying that it's not consistent with equality because it means that the neurosurgeon is more deserving than the Walmart worker?
It's also not consistent with a kind of individualism, which many modern utilitarians seem to subscribe to. I don't know. I've read, I think, most of Singer's books, and I've listened to, 25 interviews with him. I don't know if he ever stated this clearly, but he at times seems to embrace a kind of individual egalitarianism. Like, everybody's mental states matter the same. It doesn't matter if you're a king or a lowly vagabond. But in fact, my point here is just, well, that's not actually true. You start with that premise, but if you follow the utilitarian logic through, actually the lowly vagabond's mental states are virtually irrelevant because he's irrelevant to the community or to the overall utility. Whereas, say, the president is very important for the overall utility, so his mental states are actually more valuable. So the only point is, kind of intellectually undermines itself. It contradicts itself if you start from, well, the great thing about utilitarianism is, like Jesus, it promotes the golden rule, but it actually kind of doesn't if you follow it through. That was the point.
Right. Yes, I see.
Yeah, no, that might be a bit abstruse. So there are more, I think, there are more practical and easy to see objections to utilitarianism.
Can I just pause on this one just before we go over? Hold that thought,
course,
because what's interesting about your point there is what I had slightly misunderstood it, so I'm glad you clarified it. That actually, it's not necessarily, the claim is not necessarily that the pleasure, that increasing the pleasure of the influential person is more moral than increasing the pleasure of the Walmart worker. It's more that whatever you need to do to the neurosurgeon or the president's mental state in order to increase the well-being of other mental states is worth doing on balance. And it may be that you want to derange the president. He may work, not that this one needs much deranging, but this one may perform better when he's agitated and stressed, in which but it's just that the individual is being, it's a way of dishonoring the individual and making them essentially a tool. A tool, for greater purposes. Yeah.
Right, and this is why I'm not a Kantian. I think there are all kinds of problems, but I do like the idea of the kingdom of ends, where nobody is a means, everybody is an end. I know that's overstated, and there are plenty of problems with that, but I find something attractive about that. And the point that this logic ends up, it sounds beautiful at first, like everybody's mental states matter equally, and this is like this very egalitarian individualist framework. Doesn't matter if you're a king. What could be more in keeping with our democratic impulses these days, right? Or the modern era. But in fact, it just ends up turning people into tools or vectors of utility. Inevitably. And so I guess that's the point there.
Yep, I like it. What were you going to say about a more tactile problem with utilitarianism?
I think when we ask this question, what is it that we're actually attempting to maximize? Now, remember, if you're a preference-based utilitarian, this doesn't really hold. But if you're a hedonic utilitarian, there's the question, are you trying to maximize total utility, or are you trying to maximize average utility? And both of these have problems. So let's say you start with average, because that seems like the most obvious one, right? We want people on average to have a reasonably high sense of well-being. Like, again, we'll take our 100 scale, our hedonic abacus, if you called it. We'll say, we want people to be an average of like 80 or something. Maybe more than that's impossible, but it would be great if we could get to 80. Now, here's the problem. Let us imagine, and I'm pulling out a thought experiment. but this is an argument against a moral philosophy. And this argument, at least, I think, points out the logical problems with it, if not the real world problems. So let's suppose that the overall average hedonic state on planet Earth is 65. That seems reasonable, right? People aren't killing themselves.
A rating of 65 out of 100. Like 65%, the average person is 65% happy, where 50% is neutral, 0% is suicidal. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. 100% is elation.
Oh, elation. Yeah, absolutely. So we're not elated. People bitch and groan a lot. There's a lot to lament about life, but we're not offing ourselves in high numbers. So we're 65 or something. And we find there's another planet with sentient life. That planet has 90 average utility, or on this utility calculus, or hedonic calculus. So they're
90% happy.
Yeah, they're like
instead of 65.
Yeah, they're almost.
They've figured it out. Yeah, they've got society down.
Right.
They're like these miserable old fucks on planet Earth. My goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
They're like the state when I'm like running and listening to System of a Down, and I'm just like, life is pretty good right now. They're like that all the time. So they're looking at Earth, as you say, they're like, these miserable fucks, what are they? Now, suppose that the utilitarian philosopher says, well, this changes things because we're trying to increase average utility. And now we've found that there's this planet where the utility is only 65, and we used to have 90. So now we're at, depending on numbers, we're at 75, let's say, average. And then somebody says, well, you know what? If you blew up the Earth painlessly, just annihilated it with whatever nukes this sophisticated, happy society has, the average would go back up. Now, I don't see how you avoid that if your claim is we should maximize the average. I mean, that really would increase the average. Blow up the Earth as the Death Star did. What was the planet? Alderaan? I'm sorry, I'm making nerd references, but Princess Leia's home planet, I think it's Alderaan. So you just blow it up. Now, that seems to be a problem. You can think of the same thing, like you're on the Titanic. Let's say this Titanic didn't hit the iceberg. You're on the Titanic, and there's a guy with no family, no friend, nobody knows him, and he's pretty miserable. The philosopher on the Titanic's like, the average utility would go up if we could just get rid of this one person. So you hurl him overboard. He hits the water. He goes into shock pretty quickly. It's not that painful, and then he's gone. Average utility is slightly higher. People might think I'm being flippant, and I am, but I do think there's actually a serious moral dilemma there, which is if you care about averages, often getting rid of the low, the people who are bringing down the average would increase it. I think most people think that's wrong. So then you might think, well, maybe what we should do instead is try to maximize aggregate utility. So yeah, even though the person is, let's say, a 25 on the 100, they're adding to the total, and that's good. There's more of it. But then the problem is, let's say our average is 65. You could promote having more and more and more kids. And let's say that each kid is like makes life a little less pleasant for everybody. But maybe the kid is at 40, and then the kid is at 30. But you're adding to your total still. So the total is getting bigger. Let's say we colonized other planets or something. So there are trillions of people, but now everybody's at 30 instead of at 65. But there's more because we have so many more people. Derek Parfit, by the way, called this I think he called it the repugnant conclusion. Look, it seems to follow from this, if we're trying to maximize utility, you can always add a person who would make life slightly more miserable for everybody, but would increase the overall utility. And you can go on with this, until you asymptote, basically, right? And that seems absurd. I mean, I think most people would be like, if that's what your moral philosophy recommends, then your moral philosophy is wrong. Now, I don't see a way out of either of these. And Singer, to his credit, is quite lucid about this and just said, they're not an obvious answer. But I think, well, here's an obvious answer. is a wrong philosophy.
There's something about this argument in particular that I've always found like a bit of it makes me feel like when I was studying logic in philosophy at university, which I didn't like because it's so highly mathematical, and I liked all the sort of esoteric, wanky, linguistic philosophies more.
Okay.
This strikes me as something like it's trying to impose the wrong mode of calculus on the problem. Like, the argument is we should increase the amount of pleasure, and then the parfait sort of a retort is, well, okay, exactly. How are you measuring this pleasure? Because if you measure the pleasure according to the average, then you run into this problem. Actually, if you measure it according to the aggregate, then you run into this problem. So why wouldn't we have 1 trillion babies who are just marginally happy and thereby increasing quod erat demonstrandum? It's like, well, hang on, okay, yeah, if you want to put it into those mathematical terms, then the whole thing falls apart. But for me, that doesn't feel, this is obviously not a rational argument, but it doesn't feel to me like a slam dunk against the basic principle that you should increase the amount of pleasure. Like introducing 1 trillion people whose lives are just marginally worth living increases the total pleasure. But maybe I just have a problem with defining the value of a life and its pleasure and pain and complexity along a metric where it's clean to say that one is a 65, another is a 90, another is a 30. Like, there might just be something off about trying to capture human experience that way.
I share that concern. I think obviously I'm just kind of pretending. These numbers are not meant to be precise or nor am I even claiming that you could capture somebody's, complete mental state or be with a number. And I do share your concern there. I guess what I would say, though, is it seems to me that your instinct is a more pragmatic one, ultimately. You think, like, okay, yes, so Parfait is taking this very logically. He takes that logic seriously. It's like, wait a second. If we do this, let's follow this to its conclusion. Oh, that seems weird. If we go this other way and we follow it to its conclusion, well, that seems repugnant. Now, he takes that seriously. Singer takes it seriously because they're both like logically rigorous philosophers who want a completely logical, coherent, consistent moral system. I don't want that because I don't think it exists. And I think your thought is basically, well, look, this is a pretty good heuristic for the most part. Yes, of course, you can come up with these absurd examples, but it doesn't matter because nobody's going to start having so many kids that were like basically all miserable, but there are trillions of us, so the aggregate is bigger than it used to.
Yeah, exactly. And anytime you tried to impose these things onto reality, comes back to my unicorn argument, I guess. Maybe I'm just gradually drifting over to your way of thinking about morality and becoming more of a pragmatist over the course of this conversation.
Yeah, you called me a cherry picker at the start, and now you're like, hey, I agree with you.
Oh, don't make the same mistake as a minority of my listeners do, which is to think that the things that I say on this always reflect what I actually believe rather than a strategic attempt to draw someone out.
Sure.
But yes, maybe, because if you take the utopian planet that has a score of 90% happiness, obliterating planet Earth because we're less happy and thereby increasing the average happiness. In reality, when you tried to impose that on any real situation, for example, let's say that a society decided that it could increase the average happiness of its citizens by quietly and painlessly euthanizing the unhappiest half of the population, or the unhappiest 10% of the population. Obviously, that would have other effects, which is that it would distress people to live in the kind of state that disappeared people. It would distress them about whether or not they're going to end up in that situation as well. The family members would be mourning and grieving. Even the depressed guy on the cruise ship who gets tossed overboard presumably has families. What if it gets out that the cruise liner did this, or that this happened, and other people are, we live in a complicated, enmeshed network of social and moral relationships that these thought experiments don't account for.
this was the Titanic before cell phone videos, so they could really keep it back then. But I do agree. I think your point is well taken, though. That you're right. Anytime you try to come up with one of these thought experiments, there is the retort, which is a reasonable retort. Look, in the real world, this would have other consequences. I agree with that, but I would also argue that part of the reason we find throwing the guy overboard so objectionable is because we have inculcated a norm that an individual is valuable regardless. That is to say, we actually inculcate deontological norm, non-utilitarian.
Yes,
we
right.
Say individuals matter. It doesn't. We don't just care about pleasure and pain. We care about individuals, and in some sense, in our liberal worldview, those of us who remain small out liberal, the individual is the fundamental and most important unit of some kind of moral or political analysis, and I that's a deontological commitment. So
yeah, right.
I would argue that because we do that's why some of these things seem so repugnant and would have these further consequences.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, the last point that I want you to share with us in your objection to utilitarianism before we quickly go on to the other two aspects of Singer's philosophy that you object to, but less so, and they may be sort of subsets of this ultimately, cosmopolitanism and rationalism, is how unpredictable and incommensurable our mental states can be in terms of figuring out what is likely to yield better or worse utilitarian outcomes for a person's psychology.
Yeah, I became quite taken with this notion, and now I always forget the author's name who wrote the book. I think the book was called Transformative Experiences. And I really wish I could give the author credit. I always forget the author, but I heard about it first from Econ Talk. We call it the vampire problem. And basically the question goes like this. So suppose that, you're a human, somebody comes up to you and they say, would you like to be transformed into a vampire? And at first you're like, well, no, of course not. Why would I want to be a vampire? Although some people these days, goths maybe would be attracted to them, or Twilight fans. Am I going to be a sparkly vampire? Maybe.
I think it's L.A. Paul is the author of Transformative Experience, a 2014 book.
But the point with so like, let's say at first you're like, well, it seems I have to drink blood. That seems disgusting. Because what you're doing is you're using your current mental states to assess your future mental state. The point is, though, some of these things, when you're transformed, they so fundamentally alter your mental gestalt, as it were, that you can't even really compare your current state to a former state. And conversely, you can't really, from the former state, predict your future state. Having kids is a good example. I don't have kids, so I can't really speak of this subject with any subjective truth. But from people who do have kids, who I talk to, they will say, I didn't think I ever wanted a kid. And when I had a kid, after a couple of months, my whole priorities, my entire life changed. My priorities shifted. What causes me pain, what causes me pleasure, that changed. I don't want to go out anymore, or I don't really care about some abstract philosophical argument. I'd rather watch my kids smile and whatever, right? Okay, so it fundamentally alters your mental space, as it were. And the question is, well, okay, if that can happen within one individual, how do we if we can't even compare with one individual, if the measuring stick, as it were, changes and it's maybe even incommensurate, that is to say, there's just no way to compare one mental world to another mental world, how can we do that with individuals? And what does that say about what policies we should promote? Should we promote pronatal policies? Will people be happy? We don't even know, because we don't know how to compare the life of a parent to the life of a bachelor, because your priorities change so much. What you think's important changes, and so forth.
That's interesting. Why is it not the case that just renders the calculation hard. I mean, maybe philosophical and moral frameworks just are very difficult to figure out, and there's inherent uncertainty embedded. But like, it strikes me that, you know, the conclusion from this problem could either be we live in a complex and tricky world, or it could be it's meaningless to ever compare pleasure and pain, because who's to say what's pleasurable and painful? You know, we live in such a topsy-turvy, upside-down world. How could we possibly ever know?
Yeah, we're through the looking glass here. No. Yeah. Okay. So I want to reject both of those. I think that's a dichotomy we can reject both. So, we don't want to complete relativism, because of course, like, when you're a parent, you still know what feels good and what gives your life meaning and what feels bad. And some things are still awful. We could say, you know, it would be better if you weren't suffering from cancer or something. On the other hand, I don't think there's a way directly to compare these mental states. And I guess what I would say is, like, okay, suppose that we have somebody, just take an individual, and they want to know, should they be a parent? I don't know how would we even measure, like, what unit would we use? Like, if there were like some calibration where you could put this on, like there were a hedonic thermometer that you could put it in somebody's mouth and you'd be like, this person's at 78 when they're doing this or whatever. And we took every parent's and theirs was 72. So yours would actually be lower. If that were a thing, then we could do this, and we could compare these mental states. My argument would be the thermometer itself changes. There is no single measuring unit we could use. So we actually have to ask a different question. No, I should know. Preference utilitarianism doesn't have this problem.
Right.
Because you don't need to measure these mental states.
I can just assert my desire to be a parent, and that's sufficient.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Although you still run into the problem, should you prefer something, which gets into a whole different philosophical can of worms, which we won't explore. We won't open that can. But on this one,
prefer something? Yeah,
okay. Right.
All right, that's a podcast for another day, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
What's the difference between... Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit like your smoking analogy, that the smoker...
Yeah, where you don't want...
The smoker... Yeah, exactly. The smoker doesn't want to not smoke. The smoker who's trying to quit doesn't want to not smoke. They want to not want to smoke.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a meta... It's a second order desire rather than a desire. Yeah.
And there can be third order desires, and it gets really tricky. But you can want to, not want to, want, etc.
I see. Yeah.
But on this one, I guess my argument would be, ultimately, if we asked some of these moral questions, I think what we have to use is some kind of aesthetic or deontological or different kind of criteria from mental states. We have to actually just think about what we value. And what we value is not directly related. I mean, it's not independent of our mental states. Of course, our values are related to our mental state, but it's not directly related to, happiness in an obvious way. And actually, yes. I think Singer's earlier arguments about, I think maybe he made it about a novelist. Like, if you want to be a novelist, if you want to write, nobody cares about the great American novel anymore because they have TV and whatnot. But at one time, that was like the great thing. And if you wanted to write that great American novel, I could imagine somebody being so dedicated to that they actually endured a pretty miserable life trying to do that, but they had a lot of meaning. And it's like, okay, so their mental states were basically like, they had unpleasant mental states, but they had this higher order sense of meaning and fidelity to their art, to their craft.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, I think this is a stronger and deeper criticism of the pain and pleasure version of utilitarianism than merely the claim that our preferences and our pains and pleasures are incommensurable and unpredictable. This is actually saying that, I mean, it's pointing to a truth that much of what is worth doing in life is unpleasurable.
Yes,
right? I mean, all of the great things that you could want to do, whether that's having a kid, if that's your bag, or writing a great American novel, or having a great body, or becoming a fighter pilot, or whatever is your jam. It's going to be
right.
A painful and arduous
Yes.
road to get there, probably, which is tricky for the utilitarian.
Yeah, and not only that, I would say the things that are the most noble and laudable are often the most arduous. They're incredibly difficult. They require an almost ascetic commitment, right? I mean, we find that, I find that inspiring when I see it in other people, that they're so committed to something that they actually forego great amounts of pleasure, like a director or an actor who really care about their craft and not the life after the shooting on the movie that day and the cocaine and the booze and the women. They actually are like, no, I am an actor, period. I go alone and I'm dedicated to my craft, period. I find that noble and inspiring. So yeah,
right. But the problem there is that once you inject nobility and doing good into the equation, then you also introduce the variable of other people's experiences, which the utilitarian can then use to say the reason why the actor, going on a fast and starving themselves for 6 weeks in order to be able to play, some Daniel Day-Lewis part, where he has to be a prisoner, then that has a utility, which is not just the payoff is not only in Daniel Day-Lewis's subsequent mental states, but in the mental states of all of the people who were touched by that movie. Whereas in much more mundane ways, there are things that we do that even within the silo of our own brain, like having a child, for example, excluding the well-being of the child from the picture, or even let's suppose that it's even more ascetic than that. It is literally just I want to build a mural in my basement. That is an incredible work of art, and I toil away doing it, and it's thankless. Or writing a great American novel in my room.
Could be a great movie right there. The man who lives alone and creates a great work of art that nobody sees.
Right. Exactly.
It's only you. It's an existential movie.
I mean, in fact, isn't there, Bo, you may know this better than I do, wasn't there some test about the happiness of parents that had to do with asking questions on a smartphone app and getting them to rate their happiness several times a day? And then they compared that to the recollections of happiness from parents with older children, I believe.
Right.
And they noticed that having children reliably makes you less happy moment by moment, and reliably makes you more happy ultimately in the story that you tell yourself about your life. So there are different versions of pleasure.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point. And I'm not, that sounds like it was a study, and if not, it should have been. I'm not familiar with that. But what I can say is two things. One, I remember my advisor used to say, one of the most replicated effects in psychology is that being a parent makes you less happy on a day-to-day basis, right? And two, this does match like research by Kahneman, for example, where if you look at what makes people happy in the moment, so if you're just looking at that kind of happiness,
Oh, I think Kahneman inspired this. Yes, he talks about two different kinds of happiness, right?
Right, because you have you're eating Doritos. Like I know if I go get debauched, my version of debauchery is pretty tame, but it's eating Doritos and playing bullet chess or something. And I'm really happy. I got my heavy metal music on. I'm waxing fools and bullet chess, and I feel pretty good. But afterward, I feel quite empty. I don't really remember my games. Maybe one great checkmate I can remember, but it's pretty hollow. On the other hand, you go on some adventure. You climb a mountain, or you go hiking, or you have to go through a 50-hour car ride to get to Alaska, and it's beautiful. That's what you'll remember when you're dying. right? You won't be like, man, that one game of bullet chess 10 years ago was awesome. But I had those burritos, and wow, that topped it off. But you will be thinking about your trip. So you're right. And that gets even more complicated because then maybe the utilitarian can come back and say, well, see, that's a kind of pleasure. Let's not think narrowly about pleasure. When I say pleasure, I don't just mean the pleasure of, drinking a couple of beers. I mean this sustained, lasting,
exactly.
So of course, that gets more complicated. But I think, to me, the easier way to deal with this is just to accept that people care about a lot of things. Some of them are directly related to immediate mental state, like I want to have a burrito because it tastes good. And some of them are related to a rather more elevated sense of one's identity and purpose. And I don't think that fits comfortably in the hedonic utilitarian framework. Those were the preference utilitarian.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just move on to, before we run out of time, I want to touch on consequentialism. On cosmopolitanism, which you say is sort of the second component of Singerism, of Singer's worldview, in addition to utilitarianism. So far, we've just been talking about utilitarianism. But what do you mean by cosmopolitanism?
I mean, now, one has to be careful because Singer's a sophisticated thinker, so I don't want to caricature him. So let's say Singerism before attributing it to Singer. Let's do the sort of dumbed down version, which is the moral claim that all people are equally morally relevant to each person, and that distance is morally irrelevant. That is to say, somebody in Canada is morally relevant to me, or should be, as somebody in my immediate vicinity or my country.
Let's not get carried away. I mean, Canadians obviously have less moral standing than the rest of us. But this is absurd and insane, crazy snow people. Australians, of course, have more moral standing. The most famous Singer thought experiment is along these lines, which you have a problem with, which is the little boy drowning in a pond. Do you want to just remind people of this moral thought experiment?
Yeah, so I think Singer originally forwarded this in his article on famine and affluence. It's become very famous. The idea is you're walking, it's a nice day, you're feeling good about yourself, you're in pretty expensive clothes, looking good. You hear cries, turn, there's a boy in a pond, looks like he's drowning. And you look around, you think maybe his parents are there. No parents, no other adults. You realize you're the only person there. He's drowning, but you could get in and save him. If you get in to save him, however, you will...
Also, he's almost dying. Like, you don't have time to strip your clothes off. You're wearing a beautiful suit and amazing shoes. Yeah, and it's now or never. He's in the lake and you've got to go.
How do you know he's near death? Don't know, but let's just say
his little head is bobbing up and down in the frozen waters.
He's blue in the face.
Exactly.
It's like now or never. You're like, don't have time to throw your clothes off. So if you go in, you can save the boy, but you're going to ruin your clothes. And let's make it, he didn't make it this expensive, but let's make these really expensive, Armani. Let's make it, I don't know anything.
And I think he said shoes because it's more plausible that shoes would be permanently ruined. You could always get the suit dry cleaned.
Sure. Fair point. Okay, so you have like really expensive shoes, whatever those would be. I don't know, $1,000, let's say. Most people would think you were a moral monster if you said, I was going to save the boy, but I looked at my shoes and I thought, man, those are nice shoes. I don't want to ruin them. They were $1,000. I can't buy new ones. So his argument was like, okay, we all think that would be morally monstrous, but we're actually all in that position all the time. That is to say, for a mere couple hundreds of dollars, we could save a life somewhere on the planet. Every time we go to Burger King and get that milkshake, we're buying something we don't actually need, and we could be giving that money, to people in Africa who are dying of preventable diseases. And we could actually there's a website where you can calculate how much it costs to save one life. Let's say it's $3,000 or something. So
I mean, it's nowhere near that. I don't think. I think Peter Singer's. I think In the Life You Can Save, which is his book about this, which is not that old. It's reasonably recent and it's his response to people saying, "Well, I would do more if I believed that the money was actually going to do anything." But since I think that all the charity money is going to corrupt African dictators anyway, I might as well just spend it all on Nintendo. And his point is, no, there are actually very good charities, and it costs. It might cost something like $40 or something for mosquito nets. For so many mosquito nets that you're guaranteed that at least one child is going to not get fatal malaria on the basis of your $40 donation to the mosquito net charity, for example. So every time you spend $40 on something you don't care about, you are basically allowing a child to die.
Yeah. So, and I guess the price does matter. But let's say that it's not as high as you might think. It's not like a huge burden on somebody. So he says we're basically all the person who it doesn't get into the pond if we're spending our money on these luxury items. Like if we're, getting a house that's 400 more square feet than we need, or if we're getting a fancy car, if we're going out to restaurants and indulging in cocktails or whatever. I don't go out much. So at any rate, this is a very thing. I've heard some version of this thought experiment many, many, many times. And also I've heard many people say they were sort of converted to effective altruism's been probably irredeemably sullied by Sam Bankman-Fried, so I don't know how much they call it that, but some version of effective altruism, or this idea of trying to do the most good for the most people by this thought experiment.
And using a rational calculus to figure out the allocation of resources rather than relying on your heart.
Yes, right. Now, this thought experiment is interesting because it seems to me you can use the same thought experiment and show precisely the opposite of what Singer thinks it shows. To be fair to Singer again, he admits, like, this is a thought experiment. Here's the more rigorous logical argument. So grant that to him. But I thought, like, okay, you could do this thought experiment where, again, this is kind of absurd. You can say it's fantastical, but it's a thought experiment. So you have... there are different versions of this, but let's say what you were going to do with those shoes, just to take this one. Let's say that let's say it cost $100 to save a life, not 40, not 3,000, 100, whatever. And you have $1,000 shoes, and you're going to sell those shoes, and then you're going to donate all of that money to charities, and therefore you would save 10 lives with that, right? Now, let's say there's a boy there, and the choice is, do I go in and ruin my shoes, in which case I don't get the $1,000, I save one person, or do I walk on by with my shoes, sell them, get the 1,000, and then save 10 people in Central Africa? Now there, I think most people would say that the person who walked on by, got the the $1,000 and saved the 10 lives, that is morally important. Same thought experiment showing two exactly two different things, which gets to your point and is a criticism or is a concern that I share. These thought experiments are somewhat so abstract, you can almost show whatever you want. They're sort of good tools for manipulating people. I think that's a reasonable concern, and I think my argument here is not that my thought experiment shows that Singer is definitely wrong, but rather it shows that the thought experiment itself shouldn't be that compelling.
Well, no, I think you're shortchanging it. I think it does show more than that. I think it shows that there's something else going on in our moral intuition in the pond example than simply a calculus of life and responsibility. Yeah. And that something is your objection to cosmopolitanism, is your claim, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't want to run out of time, is your claim that proximity matters. That whether or not the kid is right there in front of you and you're the only person who can do something about it is morally salient. Is obviously important. Not
only is it morally salient, because I think Singer would admit that, but it's morally relevant in an intellectually justifiable way is what I want to claim. I think that we have morally rational in the sense that they can be justified, not rational in the sense that we think this through carefully. Morally justifiable, let me put it that way. Obligations to people who are closer to us, both in kin and in spatial proximity. And we should care more about those people. And in fact, I would go further and say, I don't even think we have moral obligations, positive duties or obligations to people in far off countries. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't help people there. That's what we would call supererogative, where it's something above and beyond. It's something you can do, and perhaps it's morally laudable to do so. But I don't think we're obligated to do so. I do think we're obligated to our community, to our friends and family. I think this is where...
Why are you obligated? I mean, I could agree semantically that I'm not obligated to help people in faraway lands, but only if I used the sense of obligation so narrowly that I could also say that I'm not really obligated to anybody apart from my kids and my spouse who I made a promise to. And maybe maybe my brother and mother. But even then, I don't have an obligation really to anything. If I do have an obligation to my suburb, my neighborhood, my town, my kin, then any basis on which that obligation would be founded, I think, could be extended to anyone in the world, maybe just in slightly more attenuated concentric circles of obligation. But maybe it's a distraction to call it an obligation or not. It's just like, what is the moral tug on my, doing the right thing by an African child versus by my physical neighbor? And they have to be different.
Yes, that's right. So, let me concede that the word obligation perhaps is too strong or not, it doesn't bring clarity to this. I'd like to point the concentric circles. That's just what I would say. I would agree with that.
Right.
I would say, look, we start with close family. You have moral duties to your close family that you don't have to even strangers in your community. Then maybe you go to your community, and then maybe you go to your state or in your country. And then I think beyond that, it's like morality, I would say, it's like gravity. Gravity is actually like a weak force in physics, and as distance, it becomes much weaker. So I would say, like, as we grow in distance nationally or something, our moral obligations become very, very weak, to the point where I would not judge you morally. If you said, look, like, there are probably lots of bad things happening in these places on the planet, I can't care about those things. Look, I'm trying to do a job. I want to take care of my kids. I want to live in a flourishing community. I would say, yeah, that's noble. I don't think that you should concern yourself with what's going on in the Balkans necessarily. Now, if you said to me, I care about the Balkans, I'd say, fine. That's also noble. But if you said, I care about the Balkans as much as I care about my kids and my family, I'd be like, I think you have your priorities upside down. I think you care too much about politics or world affairs or something. You should go live in your community. And I guess I would just call myself an anti-cosmopolitan. I would say I very specifically think we should care more about our community. Now, I think there are irreconcilable, or let me rephrase that. I think there are unsolvable moral dilemmas that come between conflicting obligations. And I think those are interesting, and we can discuss them, and they're explored in art very well. I think it's interesting how many great works of art explore these conflicts. I can think of one specifically, Godfather, which is one of my favorite movies. In that, there's like this conflict between Michael Corleone. He has this more abstract vision. He's going to join, I can't remember, it's the Air Force and the Army or whatever. And they're making fun of him. They're like, you're going to die for people who aren't your blood? That's just, you're being a sucker. But he has like this larger vision, if you will, this more expansive vision. So he is torn between this vision of a more objective, abstract morality and family loyalty. He eventually chooses the family, and we know how that works out for him, or it doesn't work out for him, right? But there's a real conflict there, and we feel that because we do think he, even though his family is criminal, we do think he should care about his family and his father after the assassination attempt. Antigone explodes a lot of things anyway. It's ripe for artistic exploration because these are very real conflicts. But they all, I think, illustrate that most humans are not cosmopolitans. And I think a lot of utilitarians, some of the more, what would you say, strict or stern of the utilitarians, almost consider that just a human failure that we care more of. Yes.
And I think this brings us to the crux of where you sort of wrap up your criticism of Singer, in the sense that we've touched on the problems of utilitarianism, especially of the brand that extreme Singerism advocates, an act utilitarianism that focuses purely on pleasure and pain, and the problem of cosmopolitanism, the problem of in a very practical sense of expecting that people are going to treat every human being in the planet and maybe every sentient creature with the same concern as people who are very close to them. And we don't have time to go into your criticism of rationalism, but it basically, I think it can be summed up very easily because it really does flow from the other two in one of the final lines of your piece, which is, when a moral insight yields repugnant conclusions, we should generally discard the insight, not our repugnance.
Yeah.
And that is the basic difference, I think, between your worldview and the Singerist worldview. The Singerist worldview says when the moral insight yields repugnant conclusions, you should discard the repugnance and just go with the insight. Right. And you're saying, no, we're humans who have to function in this world and have instincts for a reason, as well as reason for a reason.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well put, and I think that is a good summary of the conflict. Let me just add, though, because it sounds as though perhaps I'm appealing too much to the guts here, and not enough to the brain. Okay.
Yep.
There is an intellectual justification for that, which is a conservative one, and obviously Singer wouldn't find this very appealing. I don't think he's attracted to the conservative worldview, but it's also that things that have the human mind's fallible, it's limited. So we don't always know what will work and what won't work. You find this out through trial and error. And generally speaking, norms, moral values, and institutions that have survived and that persist in flourishing or relatively flourishing communities are probably good and probably have a kind of wisdom of which we might be ignorant. So if you come up to me and you say, well, look, I've thought about it and there's nothing good about traffic lights. Like, come on, it's so arbitrary. Like, why 3 colors? Maybe we should have 10 colors. Why not? I'd say, look, they've been around for a long time. It seems that everywhere has them. They're probably doing a pretty good job. This is
a kind of a sort of a Chesterton's fence principle, isn't it? Of don't get rid of the fence until you're absolutely certain you understand all the reasons why the fence was erected in the first place. I mean, the response, I'm sure the Singerist response would be, yes, sometimes these things are there for a reason that has served us well, and just as often they're the eruptions of human irrationalism that are not consistent with how we want to live as our highest selves. Bo, it's a fascinating piece. It's fascinating to talk to you and hear you flesh it out. Yeah. It was brave and really interesting and thought-provoking. So
great.
Thanks so much for taking us through it. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, you got it.